All right, everyone. History Buffs episode. I lost count at this
I think we're
point.
6.
Is it 7, 6? Yeah, I don't know.
I think.
6. It depends what the YouTube title says. I did write it down.
All right, episode 6, and we're going with it. History Buffs episode 6. We will be addressing one of the most contentious points of conversation, I think, around the world, I'd say, in the last 100 years plus, which is communism. We'll get right into it. We got RA is back. Welcome.
Hello.
Ted 2020, hashtag real deal. Ned Snark is back as well.
Yep. Go
Austin's
Ted.
trying to get in. His internet is apparently terrible. I think he's stealing it from a neighbor, so he's going to have to figure that out on his own. He'll join hopefully at some point soon. So let's get right into it. Question of the day, how do you wipe? Front to back, back to front. All right.
Front to back, like every other normal person on the planet.
Ned?
Well, I have a toilet with a bidet, so
Sure.
I don't need to wipe.
Well,
But when I do, well, my wife is very particular. But when I do, it is definitely from front to back.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only right answer.
Anything else is savagery.
it's barbaric.
I don't know what's more. I learned in high school some people wipe stand like sitting over the toilet, like they're not sitting on the toilet, they're like crouching, and that blew my mind. I'd never even heard of wiping back to front.
No.
Thought never crossed my mind. But
No.
yeah,
My
maybe
feeling
that's-
is a video or it never happened or it's a lie.
that's a good point.
Okay,
That's a good point. Yeah.
There's no way.
Yep. So glad we got that covered, that out of the way. Maybe that makes him a visionary, makes him who he is. Maybe that's why he's him and we're who we are.
Maybe.
Moving on to the other big topic of the week, it's election season. It's election season. Ned, you just said you discussed it on All Aboard, right? Yeah,
Right.
you have a candidate on this week, a candidate who seems like he's already trailing in the polls.
Yes.
by a substantial margin.
Troubling footage of Mr. Blind Mike.
I did see that
Yes.
on your
A
Twitter
Ray
feed a couple
Charles
minutes ago.
impression is what
I saw
Mhm.
that. Very disturbing. Very
Yeah.
disturbing. Be difficult to explain, but we had the candidate on All Aboard, which will be dropping Saturday evening after Justin's show. It premieres, and Mike and the Minifans I think runs at like 4:30 on Saturday. Runs early, so yeah, you can. We ask you all to tune in, watch he handles some very difficult questions. I asked him when was the last time he cried, and he said when he saw that he was coming on this show. So it was a good answer, but it was difficult because two of his cabinet members are my hosts. So it was rather a protectionist in
Conflict of
softball
interest.
questions.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say it. I know I might get some flack for it here, but I'm a Blind Mike guy. I'm saying
That's too bad.
hashtag Vision 2020. All right.
Sorry to hear that.
Vision.
And the reason is I view Mike as a kind of a Joe Biden, to draw a comparison. And the real person who I want is Steve Robinson. Pulling the string. He's the Dick Cheney to the George Bush.
I see.
I'm a Steve guy. I like where his head's at. I think he showed that last week by talking circles around us for minutes on end last week on History Buff.
He did mention he was the only person who had read Thucydides
Yes.
of the four of us. So
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Sorry we couldn't do that the 3 days leading up to the
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Right.
But I'm a Steve guy, and more
awesome.
so than a Mike guy in terms of this. But I think that I think Steve's going to be enough to pull Mike across the finish line. Sure, is the blackface troubling? Absolutely. He continues to get, you see the big Blind Mike tweets, he continues to get bigger and bigger, but you could look at it as Joe Biden might be done. Joe Biden might be done as president within the year, right? If he gets elected. And then Kamala steps in. I can see the same thing happening with Mike and Steve for the Senate seat. So you just got to keep Mike alive, and really it'll be Steve pulling the strings.
You see something happening to Mike after he's elected to his Senate seat.
I could definitely see that. Yeah, with all the skeletons in his closet. I mean, he's a firebrand. He's a reverend.
I'm not a huge tweeter, and I don't have a large following, but I did think I sent out a pretty damn good tweet about Oedipus was also a blind motherfucker.
I did see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, I was thinking of you three guys.
That's
nice
true.
historical allegory. And
That is true.
Massachusetts does not need another blind motherfucker in Washington. I also dropped some Castro and his mother references, and Mussolini and his mother and
Well, here's what I will say: the case against Ted is he's in a wheelchair. FDR was in a wheelchair as well. FDR was you can make an argument, one of the most power-hungry presidents in history. Served 4 terms, died in office. So the power dynamic of historically of politicians in wheelchairs hasn't been kind. So I don't know. Once he gets voted in,
I mean, I'd say he did a pretty good job, FDR. That's just me personally.
I mean, did he lead us through World War II? Fine.
He didn't finish the job, though. I'll give you that.
He did not finish the job. Nope.
He couldn't finish the job. He didn't have the guts to do it.
That's like the old All in the Family episode, Kirk's favorite sitcom, and it's not one of mine, but I do remember a hysterical episode when they referred to Archie hated Franklin Roosevelt, and Maude, his cousin-in-law, loved Franklin Roosevelt, and she said he let us out of the Depression, and Archie says, and right into World War II. So yeah, that would be a great topic for us to discuss, because I like and I don't like Roosevelt. I can argue both sides of the case. It's merit on both sides, but I think the intersectionality of the tribal thinking there, KDL, where you're saying all people in wheelchairs are power hungry. Is that what you're saying?
I'm just drawing comparisons.
I mean, it's it's right in the communist propaganda book.
I'm just drawing comparisons. That's the first politician in a wheelchair that comes to mind. That's all I'm doing. Just drawing parallels here. Speaking of FDR, one of the trickiest components he had to navigate, aside from the actual war itself, was how to deal with communist Russia, especially when the war was winding down. Led essentially right into the Cold War. Communism has been a thorn in the side of I'd say America for going on 100 years now. With the Russian Revolution that turned them communist in 1917, 1918. But even going back further than that, communism started right around the time of the Industrial Revolution. I know we talked about that a little bit earlier in an earlier episode. It started with this idea that maybe societies don't have to have these really, really wealthy robber barons like we discussed a couple episodes ago, and then a vast majority of poor working class people. So you had a British factory owner who actually tried to implement this sort of equality for all, this idea that everyone was equal, everyone's kind of sharing in a kind of a community. People weren't in it for themselves, everyone was doing their part for the community. Robert Owens was his name. He basically ran his factory and the surrounding apartments and kind of really small village around his factories that he owned as kind of a commune, basically a communist holdout in Britain, and it actually ran pretty smoothly. There were fairer wages. There wasn't really a whole lot of need for money in general. It was you'd go to work in the factory and you'd have grocers and you'd have postal delivery people, and everyone was doing their part and to try to kind of lift up the whole community. And from there, you have Karl Marx with introducing Marxism in his book, and taken over by Lenin, and obviously eventually leads us to Stalin. And really, the first major power that turned communist was obviously Russia. And then you'll have we talked a little bit before. You had Cuba, and obviously today an example is China, even though they're really not communist, but they claim to be communist still. So really, from the idea's been around for a while, all right, but from the mid 1800s up through today, it's been around and it's been trying to get implemented, and you can really see it trying to be implemented in parts here today in the United States as well. So it's definitely had its moments for sure in terms of think of like the Russian Revolution, but that really seems like that's all it might be good for. It's a nice idea. You have a revolution, you completely turn over a system that might not have treated a lot of people too fairly. But to me, it feels like, then what? Then what? Now what do we do, right? Ned, let's start with you. Let's give a.
Well, I think for supporters of candidate Geary, we should explain what communism actually is. The idea of what the ideal communist utopia would look like, and that is a worker state where the state owns all property and it supposedly evenly dispenses it out for the good of the people. The only way that can be done is to take it from people. So you've already got a problem right there. So it's not worked because, and it'll continue not to work because the people are usually compelled to communism by a minority that demonizes through identity politics and through tribalism, and then expanding that to even going beyond to, RA isn't the oppressor, but RA belongs, his grandfather might have been an oppressor. So by default, RA is now an oppressor, and he will be put on that wall and shot because of what his grandfather did. It's a way of equalizing through violent means, and that's the only way it's been implemented globally I can think of, unless it's an African country or something that you guys can think of. But when I think of Cuba, when I think of Venezuela was an election, but then they immediately seized assets of the wealthy. Latin America is always a trouble spot for communism because you do have disproportionate populations where a tiny percent hold all the power and the wealth, and the overwhelming majority are really poor, really, really poor. You're right, KDL. China started out, Mao's version of Marxism was not Lenin's version, or definitely not Stalin's version of Leninism, and it's evolved into more of a capitalism. Neither is Vietnam. Vietnam is also it's not a pure communist state, although technically it is. It defines itself as a people's republic. Could North Korea be defined that way as a pure communist?
That's tough because that's so more utilitarian. That's so
correct.
It's
way more Stalinist.
Yeah,
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it can't work in those countries that have a strong religious identity. So it's not worked in Islamic nations, and it won't work in Islamic nations unless there's a complete cultural change there, right? Mm-hmm. So it's failed in every attempt. It was tried in Iran. The Russians tried to export it to Iran during the Iranian Revolution. It failed. Mm-hmm. It was a short window, didn't make it. They tried it through into Afghanistan and also into the Chechen Republic and their Soviet states back in the day. It never really took hold. So first of all, the people were very isolated, so it would take a lot for the central state in Moscow to go into those places. But they clung to their religion. They did away with the Eastern Orthodox Church, but Islam throughout the Soviet republics during its time of being alive was still there, outlawed but turned a blind eye to actually enforcing it. They couldn't. So a strong religion or religious country keeps communism at bay for whatever reason. We can talk about that definition too and why that works, but it doesn't work.
Right, but part of part of Marx's essentially manifesto was you have to remove things like religion.
Yep.
You have to remove things that bring unity to people. That's not the state, or that's not
correct.
I guess the idea to lift up all workers, even though it's really the state. The idea to lift up all workers will be done by the government.
To lose all other associations except when you're in the Soviet Union, they didn't want you to be Chechen, they didn't want you to be Ukrainian, they wanted you to be Soviet. They didn't want you to be Christian, they didn't want you to be Jewish, they wanted you to be Soviet. They wanted you to be comrades. So that's
right.
Like you're saying.
And again, the failure, just using that example, all right, the failure was that Stalin was looked at as a Georgian when he was on the outside of the inner circle of Lenin's group in the early 20s or even in the late teens during the revolution. Khrushchev was also an outsider. He was a Ukrainian.
Yep.
So there was no matter what they say they do. Oh, there we go. Austin's in.
He's back.
Yeah, finally.
Wow.
He's back. Let's go.
I was in, I could hear Connor, and then Ned started talking. He was dead silent. I'm like, what the fuck is going on now?
Well, then you didn't much. Yeah. Great. Good. So we're just talking about, communism and where it's been attempted and its versions and why it's failed. So Ari was just saying that, they take away your identity, but in reality they don't. Yeah. And even within the old Soviet Union, there was definite biases towards provincials, regional people.
Yep.
And unless you were from Moscow or St. Petersburg, if you were Ukrainian or Belarus, you were looked at as, a country bumpkin, an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
So
do you think that's
go ahead?
Do you think that's? I was going to ask. Do you think that's still true with how Marxism is kind of coming into America today? Do you think there's still individuality?
Who are you asking? On any of us?
Individuality in the
I
country,
was asking you, Ned, because you're. Yeah.
Well,
so I mean, the way I see it coming into
Well, I mean, there's been I hate to sound like a total turd on this, but there's been a creeping through language. There's been a creeping infiltration into our culture in the past 30 years, and it's through language. And I know I'm old enough to be all your guys' fathers, but when I was a kid, there was no Irish American, there was no African American, there was no Italian American. You were, yeah, I'm Irish, of Irish descent, or I'm Irish Italian, something like that. None of the hyphenation. And I've noticed, like, as it's now accepted, you know, now you're Mexican American, you know, you're Cuban American. Although if you tell a Cuban that they're Cuban American, they'll say, no, I'm a Cuban. You know, right. So I mean, it's just very strange, and they do it through language, and that the language becomes thought, right? You know, if you externalize your thoughts, it becomes a language, and they can like, I know this sounds trite, but they will brainwash you through application of language and words. So they can never do away with it. Even in Cuba, there was still a class system. It's unsaid, but there's an accepted class system in Cuba based on the color of your skin. The lighter people are on top and the darker people are on the bottom. And Cuba was made up of Spaniards, Carib Indians, and African slaves cutting sugar. So there's been a homogeneous or a multigenerous race for many years. And sad to say, I'm sorry, but that's the fact, is if you're lighter skinned in Cuba, you're higher up. If you're darker skinned, you're not so high. That's the way it is.
Right.
So it doesn't work even in a communist utopia. But if you go to North Korea, we can talk about that.
All right.
My point was going to be that the reason why communism doesn't work is, so Marx is an economist. Marx isn't a politician. He's not so much of a political thinker. He's nuts and bolts, money, numbers, all that good stuff. And his like interpretation, he wanted like an egalitarian society, stateless, almost like anarchic. You know, there was real loose organization. He just didn't want any class, but he had no.
He wanted to get rid of countries.
Yeah, he had no real way to implement it. He didn't have that capacity of thought. So then you get Lenin, who's like, hey, you know, we're just gonna make it easy. It's gonna be a party, but the party's gonna do. You know, we're still gonna care about the workers, but the party's gonna care about the workers. And in every instance since Lenin, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is what Marx said, that's what he wanted, became the dictatorship of the party. And that is why communism does not work. Because you get it goes from an egalitarian society to an oligarchic society.
Correct.
And in some cases where you get like Stalinism and Maoism a little bit, it becomes, you know, everyone puts their own flavor to it. You know, whereas Lenin was, we're going to spread this around the world. We're going to do all this good stuff. Like, you know, but if you disagree with us even a little bit, you're done. You know, he started the Bolsheviks, got rid of all the Mensheviks, dies. Stalin's like, hey, you know what? I don't like spreading it. We're just going to keep it eternal, but I'm going to be ruthless and authoritarian and basically be more of a fascist about it.
Correct.
So so you have that. And then also in the communist, I guess, like work ethic, there's no motivation. Correct. If everyone is getting paid the same amount to do the same thing, there is no motivation whatsoever, because I think human nature is based on greed. So the greed will push you to want to do better, want to, you know, have incentive to do better. Whereas you get Soviet stagnation in like the 70s, that's because everyone just sort of figured out, hey, I can do, why would I do any more work than the guy next to me? We're getting paid the exact same amount. And then you start fudging the numbers, you know, to please your higher ups, and it just snowballs from there. So it is never going to be a dictatorship of the proletariat. It will always be a dictatorship of the party, and that is the fundamental issue with communism.
Right, and to prove that point, you see it in human nature even today. Think of the PPP loans, where that raised they raised unemployment by basically doubled it, right? Yeah. And you know there were people that, and they were right, but there were people that said, why would I work to make $1,100 or $1,200 when I could collect unemployment for $1,200? I mean, I think it's
a good quote from my friend was that it was fiscally responsible for him to get fired at one point.
Yeah,
right.
So it goes into that, but it's the same thing, and I feel like human nature just adheres to capitalism better. And you also take into consideration, I guess I'll save it for if we talk about, you know, will it ever come up again? But yeah, basically there's no incentive to do any kind of work. your economy is going to collapse. And it just always, every single instance you can find, it turns into a dictatorship of the party.
Yep. Yeah, it turns into one guy's version of what he thinks communism should be for the rest of the country.
Correct.
It's like, I don't know, guys. I know how I can do it. I know how to do it. Here's how to make all of you equal. Yep. Mind you, I'm still running the country, but I'm going to make all of you equal. Don't worry.
Yeah,
now,
exactly.
I used to have a theory too. Are you back in, Austin? Can you hear us? I think so. Here we go.
It's like, yeah, it comes and goes. Yeah. Can you guys hear me now?
Jump in. We hear you fine. So just jump in when you can. I know it's going to be difficult, but go right. We'll stop and let you talk.
Yep.
Yeah.
But would think that. Oh,
go ahead. Sorry. I'm sorry, guys. Well, are any of you guys Star Trek fans? So I think communism could actually work in like a world like Star Trek. So I think the big issue is that there's scarcity of resources and everything. So if you have like a replicator that can just keep making food and basically money becomes obsolete, then like a communist society kind of could work. I think a big limitation to it in like a modern society today is that there's always going to be scarcity. So like you said, RA, like I think I agree with you that human nature relies on greed, but if you can just completely eliminate that factor, then it could work.
But also competition. Yeah.
Competition. It's
and competition.
To do better than like in the Industrial Revolution, the robber barons, and that was all competition. That's what it stemmed from. Was just this huge, and it kind of goes back to like utilitarianism, like what's the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
Correct.
Capitalism's more greed based, but I just think I don't think we'll ever see. I mean, you've never seen pure communism as like Marxism as Marx laid it out, but we're not going to. You'll see people be like, oh, we're communist, kind of like China, North Korea, Vietnam.
Yep.
There's a couple other communist countries, Somalia maybe, but there's a theory out there that's called.
I didn't think Somalia had like a centralized government. I thought they were just in open
Africa
chaos.
Well, there've been African. I don't know if they're still communist, but there've been African communist nations. See, I was thinking more like with Cuba, the smaller. Like I have a theory too that democracy, the center can't hold. That as populations exponentially increase, democracy fails. It becomes more regionalized. But I also think communism does not work on a large scale. But I'm wrong because I thought that eventually Cuba will get it right. And a small island nation, kind of secluded. They did make the mistake of trying to export their brand of communism throughout Central and South America. That didn't work. But even a small island nation like Cuba, with plenty of natural resources, with a viable trade, they couldn't get their shit together, and it's an economic failure. They just live on tourism.
Right.
Because you have the ruling party at the top.
Correct.
Yep. Yeah, and I know I'm not breaking down any barriers here. Coming with any revolutionary takes, but you look at the Enlightenment, which came, 100 years, 50 years before Marx came out with the Manifesto. The Enlightenment ideas, they were all or a lot of them were implemented in, or tried to be implemented in the French Revolution. They were implemented in the United States at the start of the American Revolution, but they weren't taken verbatim and said, okay, this is the exact way to live. You look at a guy like, John Locke, who is for, freedoms that would be viewed as liberal today, some of them.
Yeah.
The good was taken and the rest was left. Whereas communism never, you see it happening naturally. Like in China, for example, today they are communist, but economically they try to be as capital as possible.
And they're more totalitarian than anything.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But you've never seen a country really try to take communism and say, let's try communism at like 30%. Or 40%. I mean, an example could be like the United States today with the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, unemployment. That's theoretically could be an example of communism, or at least socialism early on, right? But you haven't seen, a communist country try to really, say, let's try communism at like, 50% and see what happens. No, it's always 100% all the time.
They do that,
right? It happens naturally,
unintentionally. But like we said, Mao will sit there and write his little red book that's like the best-selling book of all time besides the Bible,
right?
And it'll be like, annotate quotations of Chairman Mao or something like that.
Yeah, which are really Sun Tzu, by the way.
So it could be comparatively to what he viewed communism as, whether it be Stalinism or whatever he read Marx. He's just like, okay, this is my 50% version of communism. You know,
Right.
we'll do collectivization. We'll do a couple great leaps forward. A couple million people will die, but
Yeah.
hey, you know what? It'll pay off in the end. It'll be able to swim in the Yangtze, and we'll be fine.
Yeah. And you know, when you talk about the Age of Enlightenment, which was in the latter half of the 18th century, and you're right, the U.S. Revolution and the French Revolution, but Marx and Engels wrote together in London, by the way, at the height of the Industrial Revolution. But also, it didn't happen in England, but in Europe in 1848, when the book was published, Europe was going through a massive social changes. There was revolutions across the continent, and you began to see the slow disintegration or the lessening of absolutism in monarchies, and you saw revolutions and people's revolutions, whether they were successful or not, that could be argued, but they were ultimately successful because it gave people more of a say in the central government. So you saw the fracturing of the Hungarian Empire to become the the Austrian Empire fractured, and it had to become the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in around that time. You also saw, like, you know, France was they had how many republics? 2 in that time period. You know, the first republic, and then they had, I think, the second and third. We're now on the 5th, but so they had Louis Napoleon. It was a tumultuous period and time to live in. So I can imagine those guys writing about a utopia state where everyone is equal and free and we share and whatever. But the interesting thing is they're writing it in 1840s England, which was the height of the Industrial Revolution in England.
Yep. And that carries all the way up through World War I. You have the Red Scare in the U.S., but in really bad in Great Britain, where they were teetering on revolution after the Soviets had theirs a couple years before.
Through trade unions. Trade unions have always been the banner, the probing organization of communism in democratic countries. Trade unions. Now we're gonna have a discussion on that as well, because at the time unions were definitely needed, right? You had miners, people working extremely dangerous jobs, being treated like shit.
Mines for
30 or even
kids working in mines or factories.
Exactly.
9-year-olds shouldn't be working in mines.
Right. But the Haymarket riots of Chicago of 1888 were communist driven trade union riots. Mm-hmm. And even Eugene Debs, actually in 1912, I think, right? Eugene Debs ran as the American Communist Party candidate for president. I think against Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson.
Was that when Teddy came back with the bull moose?
Yeah.
That was the bull moose part? Yeah.
So, I mean, it's been around in this country for a while, but it's never really caught on because through I think, and maybe you guys have a different view, but I think through market forces change the conditions, and the market rectifies itself and rights itself.
Yeah. I think it's based on really a lot of American individualism. You know, think of like some like the pioneers or people just picking up, moving their family hundreds, thousands of miles out west. I think it's Americans don't like being told what to do, for better or for worse. And I think that's part of it is, you know, if it was a communist society, they're being told what to do by, you know, a government that really has proven in a democratic society, in a republic, that sometimes doesn't have their best interest in mind. So I'm going to give that same government all of the power to tell me how to live my life all the time.
Well, it's not even how to live your life. It's just how to, like, they just could, like, in theory, it would be economically, they would tell you what to do.
Correct.
Not with like your personal liberties and stuff like that. Because like I said, Marx didn't give a shit about any of that. He was just concerned with the dollars and cents of it.
Right, but what it turned into also, I'm thinking of, you know, Stalin in Russia. If you disagreed, you're being sent to Siberia. Yeah. If you were a writer, it limits free speech and thought too.
Right.
Oh yeah, it limits creativity. It limits everything.
Right.
And your economy just goes to the shit. Like, you don't have any new innovations. All your scientists are fleeing.
Right.
You know, you got all that stuff going on. Like, it's just bad news. But
in fact, that's you know, I'm sure you guys have read like The Right Stuff. It was a Tom Wolfe book about the early the Mercury 7 space astronauts. But one of the chapters in the beginning was when the U.S. and Russia were into Germany. They grabbed as many scientists as possible.
Oh yeah,
forcibly.
Werner von Braun.
Yep, and whether they were Nazis or not, but the Russians grabbed German scientists and the Americans grabbed German scientists, and the thought was our Germans are better than your Germans, Russia.
Yeah.
Even though they got up into space first, we eventually got to the moon and went past them because of also our economic power as well. They couldn't sustain it.
Yeah.
But that's
when they opened up, in the 80s with perestroika and then glasnost, they were pretty much just like, these people are just backwards. Like they invest everything in the military.
Yeah.
And it's just smoke and mirrors. When you're communist and you have to have people in the CIA trying to figure out what you're doing all the time. You can hide a lot from yourself, and then censorship amongst your people. And really however, the Soviet Union went, for instance, is how pretty much the rest of the world except China and North Korea went for a very, very long time.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
They broke.
So all the issues that they had, it just turned into a cancer.
Yeah.
And you had all of Eastern Europe just rotting away without anyone really knowing, even the people living inside of it. Even though they know, I'm not doing anything. I'm not doing anything to work. But I'm still, getting a paycheck. I can still read. I can do all this good stuff. But
right, yeah. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry to say.
I was going to say towards the end of the close to the fall of the Soviet Union in the 80s, those Soviet bloc countries were falling off or breaking away from the Soviet Union, and Russia was like, okay, yeah, please go. Like you're costing us too much money, essentially. Yeah. So whether you like it or not, this perfect society. If you have money involved, if you still need to purchase things, if you're not just given everything, if you need to buy things, the economic burden, I think, will always win out, which is why you see countries like China opening up their economy. Russia has done it, a few times.
Well, and if you guys remember too, in the late 50s, there was a pretty major break between the Soviet and the PRC, between actually. Even Stalin and Mao. Mao had just come to power in 1949, and Stalin dies in 53. But during that time, there was almost a hot war out on the Mongolian border of where China and Russia meet. Oh yeah,
I knew they weren't very good friends.
They split, but then they come back together when it suits both of their interests. But there was definite friction. They both had very different views of Mao thought that he was being more pure communist in the tradition of Marx, Engels than Stalin. He saw Stalin more as a tyrant and a fascist, even though Mao was, oh my God, a huge fascist. And by 66, when they had the Cultural Revolution of 1966 with Ari, what you're saying, like the Little Red Book, he was well on his way to being just a despot.
God. Yeah,
a despot.
He's a god.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Even today, like I said, that's the second best-selling book of all time.
Oh yeah,
behind the Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen the HBO miniseries Chernobyl?
Oh yes.
Yes.
I think that's if you haven't seen it, check it out. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. Yeah. Obviously, it's about the Chernobyl explosion. Takes it through all the events, the major events after the explosion. It starts pretty much right at the explosion, and then the last episode kind of goes back to leading into that night, what happened, why did the explosion happen. But I think that's kind of the best example, the best visual example of communism at work or not at work in history. So this scientist who's picking up these nuclear ratings hundreds of miles away saying, this is devastating. This is going to ruin all of Eastern Europe. The person she's talking to he goes, 4 years ago, I worked in a shoe factory. Now I'm in charge of whatever.
Oh, yeah.
But this scientist needs to go to this person to get clearance to basically warn a whole region of people that could die. Yeah,
they thought it was Americans. Is it the Americans?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So I wrote my senior thesis in college on the Chernobyl accident and the Chernobyl cover-up. So watching that miniseries was like porn.
Oh yeah,
I fucking loved it.
Yeah.
The people in Sweden 4 days later picked up radiation on their on their instruments, and they were like, "What the fuck? Like we gotta call everyone." And then they were able to, based off the wind patterns, were like, "Holy shit, this is coming from the Ukraine." And only then was Gorbachev supposed to all of a sudden was just kind of like, all right, so maybe there was something, like I don't want to get too into it, but maybe we let off a little bit of nuclear fuel.
I was 19, 20 years old. And I remember, it was a big, big deal because that was also, was it 86 or 83? Sorry.
86.
Okay. Sorry. I was a little older, but it was, things were not really good they were getting better for the US, but there was always tension during the Reagan years of a nuclear holocaust could be triggered. Now, looking back, I see that was total bullshit. And it was done by the media to keep us in fear. But you did have an 83, the Russians shoot down a Korean Airlines passenger aircraft that strayed over their airspace, which is kind of horrifying. It happened again in 2007 over Chechnya. Over
I remember that.
Yeah.
But you had, so in 86 when it happened, you also had in this country this, not a fear, but mistrust of nuclear power. So when
3 Mile Island had happened in 79, maybe 78.
Correct,
late 70s.
Before that, you had
Pennsylvania. Yeah.
What's the one that's closed now? The one in Seabrook. And I remember driving up to Maine as a kid, going through protests. No nukes, no nukes.
A nuclear power plant just shut down. I'd say it is 5 miles by the ocean from my house.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes.
Pretty old.
They just shut that down. During 9/11, they actually put it on lockdown because it was a prime terrorist target. Yeah. I remember asking my 5th grade gym teacher, we were talking about it for some whatever reason. And I was just like, what happens if that ever goes? And he goes, you're just done. He goes, unless you have a motocross bike or a dirt bike, you can weave in and out of traffic, you're just gone. Take your, because you can get iodine pills down the street at any pharmacy. You can get them for free.
Sure.
Yeah.
But keep in mind too that the reactor that was built and shown in Chernobyl was only built by the Russians.
And they're still active.
Yeah, but I mean,
there's around maybe a half dozen of them that are still active. And they were able to override they were able to override all the safety systems. Everywhere else on the planet, you cannot shut it off completely.
Right.
You just can't. Right. But they were just okay, we're just going to bring it down to nothing pretty much just to see what happens. That's literally what they were doing. They were hey, let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens when we make this as unstable as we possibly can.
Yeah, because they were trying to test the range of the reactor. Or something.
Well, they're doing a safety test.
Yes, it was a safety test.
It was a safety test. Yeah.
Unbelievably, and
But what I was trying to stress, though, even at the time in the U.S., when we heard about it, like Ari said, the Swedes reported it, and then the radiation was found in West Germany, and then in France because of the prevailing winds, and it was oh shit, something happened in Russia. We had no idea of the severity, and then once we did, as Americans do, a couple of years later, we forgot about it. What this series brought back was how close to utter destruction of Western Europe. And my wife and I both I don't remember this. I don't remember any of this.
Direction.
Yeah.
If the winds, the only thing that saved Kiev, and it was a matter of, it was kind of like in Japan in 2011 when they had the nuclear meltdown.
Fukushima.
All of the wind was pushed out to sea.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you would have had an environmental, ecological, and just a humanitarian disaster in Japan. So it was all based on where the wind was. But I actually sidetrack, but I was able to look at some of the reports from the Soviets. I was able to look at their archives and stuff like that, and they had reports from when it was built, being hey, there's a crack in the foundation right where the nuclear fuel is, and it was Andropov who was the head of whatever commission was signing off on these things, and he was just yeah, it's fine, whatever. There was fundamental flaws in the design of these reactors and in the foundations that they acknowledged. Correct. And we're just you know what, whatever.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, just kind of wrap that thought up. I think one of the best quotes from the show was this disaster could have only happened in the Soviet Union or in a communist country like the Soviet Union, and the reaction or the way it was responded to eventually after people stopped turning a blind eye to it and realized, oh shit, we might have a problem here. The response by the Soviet Union could probably have only been pulled off in the Soviet Union in terms of, because even they were throwing army troops into kill dogs and 100-mile radius around or kill animals that in abandoned villages. They were literally stripping soil of, I think it was, what was it? You might know better than me, Ari. It was 50 square miles around Chernobyl.
Yeah, there's an exclusion zone. I think it's 50 or 100 miles.
Yep. Yeah. So the response could have only been pulled off in the Soviet Union. However, the issue itself probably could have only happened in the Soviet Union as well. So I guess that brings us to my last question to both of you is, what would it take to make this idea, that I think we all probably agree on paper, doesn't sound terrible. I mean, everyone has everything they need, and everyone's living, singing Kumbaya, holding hands together. What needs to happen to make that a reality? Is it possible to make that a reality, RA?
No. At this point in time, it's too late. Marx said that the something about the end of history being, the revolution of the proletariat. The end of history is liberal democracy, and there's a theory out there called the democratic peace theory. And if you think about it, when was the last time two liberal democracies went to war?
Yep, I think we touched on that a little bit in the last episode too. Yeah,
we're talking about China.
Yep,
it doesn't happen.
Right.
You can just in today's world, you will not find I feel like if anything's going to happen, it's going to be liberal democracy. I don't think you will ever find communism in its pure form, in a different form, unless you've got some kind of. I mean, you could have it masked under some coup, but other than that, it's fallen out of style. It's a fad that lasted 100 years, and now it's.
But it will be attempted again and again, and it's going to be attempted here, and it's been, in my opinion, it's been in the works. For 40 years, since about 1970, through schools, through the institutions, the media, education. They're making kids more stupid by not teaching them. Even I'm probably one of the last that was in the classes where you had advanced students and then you had special needs students. And now I mean, my kids said when they were educated in Maine, they got a good education, but they're like, Old Orchard Beach didn't have like advanced classes.
AP classes.
Yeah, it really depends on there are some schools. So for example, I have some teacher friends that teach in districts that their grades aren't actual grades. Like you can't get below a 60. Yeah, you can't get below a 60% on if you don't turn an assignment in, it's automatically a 60. So you can't fail. Grades aren't actually grades. There's really no way to score anyone on their work. It's really more like a graded on completion thing. How did you try? Okay, you go to the next thing. There's
communism.
Yeah, no,
that's exactly how it works.
But there's not
communism through bad parenting. I think.
That's it.
I think it's the parent. I think that
get a check for trying.
I think that's the parents' fault because everyone gets a trophy.
Yep.
But I do feel that towards in the latter half of the 20th century that they've tried to lower the bar for more. Again, you're not going to. When I was a kid, we get our report cards and all my buddies, and we were all like jocks and whatever, but we'd all like sit there and like, okay, what did you get in AP Algebra 2? And it'd be like, well, I got an A-. I'm like, fuck, I got a B.
Yep.
And you felt like felt like shit. Yeah.
It's the removal of competition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was like you were in class with these guys and or most of them, and you wanted to do better than them. So it was like it was a competition. I never saw that with my kids. So they take out the competition, they lower the bar for average rather than excellence, and people get fed and they'll eat whatever's fed to them by, the language. I keep going back to the language, but it's like it is this language of intersectionality. It's everyone is going to be defined by a group. We're no longer Americans. We're now defined by subgroups.
Right.
What does that have to do with communism?
Because that's how it worked. That's how like not national, but socialism towards communism.
Be careful there.
Because National Socialism.
Yeah, let's take it easy.
But Steve was right. But Steve was right last week when he said,
KDL's right here, right? Let's take it easy.
Yeah, please.
But it's a circle, and they do end up touching. National Socialism, fascism, and communism end up. The circle is complete. So Hitler and Stalin weren't that far apart, except
they weren't that far apart. But historically, as you know, the fascism and communist ideals are polar opposites. But so much so to the point, like you're saying, the extreme right and the extreme left, even today, are essentially it's circular. It's coming around.
Yeah.
I'd say the extreme right and the extreme. I'd say the left and the right are similar in that they don't really care about the average person. Like they can say whatever they want, and they just don't really care. Either way, as long as they get elected, they don't give a shit. I don't think Nancy Pelosi really cares about like BLM or anything like that. I don't think she does.
No,
but yeah, but that what you were saying that about like fascism, like Stalin being fascist pretty much. Well, that was Stalinism. That's just an off branch of communism, like
totalitarian
communism, because you'll see Nedism somewhere in Florida. Start the People's Republic of Ned. And it's going to be, you can be like, hey, we're communists now.
Right.
But it's not going to be that because there is no such thing as there's no defining communism.
Well, you saw it attempted a little bit with Chaz and Chop this summer.
Maybe. Right. And it failed.
Yeah. Or at least an attempt, or they wanted this kind of utopian type society where everyone did their part and, brought everything they needed and shared and this and that. And then, you have murders and, police ambulances getting called, but they're not being let in. So that they, there's no system in place for this to actually work.
And, and again, I keep looking at scale because I in my mind, it's like, it must be, maybe China can do it through authoritarianism. Right, 1.3 billion people.
Yeah.
So they got to have some sort of everyone's got to conform. But that's why I thought a Cuba, maybe it could work in a small country. But then Cuba, of course, did fail. But then I was watching carefully this Chop and Chaz thing, and it was just anarchy. It didn't work at all. Utter failure. But you know what? When we used to define the age of Stalin as totalitarianism, so he was communist, but it was considered totalitarian, where the state. Yeah. The man is the state is it.
And then I am the state.
I am the state. Correct. Yep. Oh, very good. But then later on, it was after Stalin was long gone, by the time I was a kid in school, it was communist China. Red China was a totalitarian state. Because this is after 1966, right? This is in the 70s. And that's just the way it was. And even when Nixon went there and tried to open them up, it was still like, but see, Americans have a strange affinity for China, believe it or not, because Chinese immigrants have always come here and they worked their asses off on the railroad, made a good life for them especially on the West Coast or in cities.
Really helped to build up the West Coast cities in the West Coast.
Absolutely,
railroads.
Fundamentally important to the development of California. Absolutely, and the coal and also the gold in the gold mining. The gold rush time as well. And there was also this, Pearl Buck would write these books on missionaries going to China to help Christianize them. So it's kind of a romantic issue. When China fell to communism, it was a huge, shocking blow to the U.S. because we just finished World War.
And we were their allies. Like we had helped.
Exactly.
Check.
Correct.
And then to watch him, run away to Taiwan must have been.
Well, he was the wrong horse to back. And one of my personal heroes is George C. Marshall. And that's the only place that he wasn't successful is what Truman asked him to go to China and talk to Mao Zedong to see what they can work this out. And he couldn't cut a deal with Mao Zedong. So It's like when China fell, it fell hard. And Americans, I grew up in my neighborhood in Burlington. I grew up in Burlington, Massachusetts. And one of my best friends who shared my first name, his parents fled Mao's China. They were older parents. They were probably in their 40s, maybe even early 50s. And he was about like my age at the time, like 10 or 11. But Mrs. Yao used to tell me stories about living before Mao and then living during Mao and then fleeing. And they were Catholic, by the way. They were Roman Catholic. Wow. So they were Anglicized, or not Anglicized. They were Christianized and then they fled. And it was a fascinating story. But Chinese communism has been evolving and has really taken off since Bush 41 gave them most favored nation trading status in, what was it, 91, 92? And since then, they've seen the cash come in and their growth is alarming.
I will backtrack. I will say that communism might happen in a very small country. Maybe not a Cuba, but I'm thinking like San Marino. Like if San Marino, everyone or
Rhode
Andorra.
Island.
Yeah, exactly. Like something that size, like Liechtenstein.
Andorra.
If they could go,
Luxembourg.
And exactly. I'm not even talking like a Denmark, even though
Grenada.
Maybe. I mean, I still think that's too big. I'm talking like a population under 100,000 people, like Monaco could go communist. But other than that, it's just not going to happen because you'll never find. And especially in like a country like this or like the larger countries, you'll never find the
but it also has to have a sustainable communist or economy.
And that right there is the juxtaposition, maybe.
Yep.
Is that in those small countries you don't have that. You
No.
don't have the resources available. You need something the size of Russia, the size of the United States, like Brazil, to have those type of resources to maintain that kind of economy.
Yeah.
So it's a conundrum, I suppose.
Yeah. Now, just to kind of wrap it up, I mean, if I could, kind of predict the future a little bit, I'd say that there's no way communism in its current form or in the form that we all think of it as could succeed. What I could see happening, and this is hundreds of years away, but some sort of blend between, that you have, like in America, for example, Democratic Republic, getting closer to at least socialism with certain things over the past 100 years. You have Russia, China, for example, getting closer, at least economically, to a more of a free market capitalist type society. I could see a blend happening where it's almost like a 50-50 split. You know, it's economically very, very open, very, very, you know, free market capitalist, but then socially it's we're all equal, we're all, you know, there's no classes, we're all doing our part to succeed. I could see some sort of blend like that, but even as I say it, I don't know how you'd pull something like that off. I just don't know how you'd pull it off.
We lost Austin, but that's Star Trek.
Yeah, I know, right? I wonder what that.
Exactly. So I wish he stayed in this one. He was a poli-sci major in college, and I remember him telling me that a class he took. He took a class that, you know, they taught politics through things like Star Trek, like Game of Thrones, like other, you know, TV drama, movies, and they talked about, like, you know, the type of society, the type of government that would happen, you know, in that world, and it related it to, you know, stuff we see around the world today, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, he seemed to have had some thoughts on socialism.
Yeah, well,
we'll get him next week with a better connection.
Maybe you can do the wrap-up show after this.
Yeah, hopefully.
So I think we'll probably get about 7 views. Well, that's okay, you know.
Hey, whatever.
Communism's a grabber. I don't know.
I love communism.
I don't even know, but these are always fun. You guys are great. We have
come for the hot political takes. Stay for seeing RA getting heated over communism.
Exactly.
And the progress of the drywall.
Yep.
And if Austin's connection is going to work.
Yeah. Tune in next week to see how long he stays in for.
All right.
We're all set.
We're good.
Thanks
everyone.
Thank you.